Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thanks, as always, to the Harvard Bookstore for putting on these events. What a wonderful series that's coming up. And Ed Wilson, a very special welcome to you. It's great to be here, and congratulations on the publication of Ant Hill.
Thank you, Colin.
One of the great privileges I've had as an editor over the years has been the task of editing, and I use that word laughably. Ed Wilson at Vanity Fair, at the Atlantic Monthly, and long, long ago at the Wilson Quarterly. E.O. Wilson is a literary scientist, which is part of a grand tradition. Why is it that scientists so often write so well? That goes back to Darwin and Galileo, and I'll embarrass you if I keep mentioning names. I'd like at some point, though, to come back to just the idea of your writing and how you came to be the kind of writer you are. But first, a few words of introduction and biographical background. E.O. Wilson is a professor emeritus at Harvard University, and his actual official former title is too long to read. He first came to public attention with his book Sociobiology, which argues for the biological basis of all social behavior. In the course of his career, he has published some 30, or is it 40? 30 or 40 books? 30 books. Yeah. Two of them won the Pulitzer Prize. He has taken on topics ranging from ants up to God, or maybe from your perspective, from ants down to God. His work has aroused immense controversy. He once had a pitcher of water poured over his head by a member of the audience at a public event. No. Which I'm confident will not happen tonight. No.
Go on.
E.O. Wilson's new book departs from his previous books in one large respect. It's a novel, his first work of fiction. And for a first novel, I just learned it has actually cracked the New York Times bestseller list. For those of you who haven't read it yet, you should know that it's a coming-of-age story about a boy down south in an area around a place called Lake Nockabee, Alabama, a boy named Raph Cody, who comes to know and love his small patch of local earth, and especially the ants, and goes on to become a scientist and a lawyer and become embroiled in environmental fights over development and preservation. And in the middle of the book, there's this magical novella about ants, which is a narrative, dramatic version of this boy's undergraduate thesis. And on top of that, there's a love scene. If you count the ants, there's more than one love scene.
Takes place at Harvard, too.
Yeah, exactly. So I have a few questions that I'd like to ask. We'll talk about a half an hour or so, and then we can throw the conversation open to the audience and have about a half an hour for that. So let me start with a very foundational question. I remember once, years ago, you're telling a story about how it was that you came to look at the insect world as opposed to other parts of the natural world. And I think it involved a fishing trip and an accident. Could you take us through that story?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. First, I'd like to pay the interlocutor here a compliment. I've maybe written a dozen fan letters in my life. One of them was to this gentleman when he was on the Atlantic. So I'm honored that you have.
Now remember, I won't tell you what it got on eBay either.
What?
I won't tell you what it got on eBay.
Anyway, how did I come to work with insects? Well, I like to say that every kid has a bug period. I just never grew out of mine. But there was a reason why I didn't grow out of it. And it turned out, and I really never understood this until I was an adult, that I would classify as such, but I'm handicapped. I had injured this right eye fishing when I was a boy down on the Gulf Coast. And in fact, I lost the vision in this eye. So I was one-eyed from the age of 7 on. And when I decided, growing up in the beautiful woodlands of southern Alabama and the panhandle of Florida, I wanted to do that all my life. I just wanted to stay outdoors all my life. I naturally did what all young naturalists do, and that is I started with birds. And I soon discovered I was the worst bird watcher in the world. It has something to do with monocular vision. You know, you really can't you can't do very well spotting and following birds, and somehow it just doesn't work. We do happen to have in the audience one of the world's foremost birders and naturalist, and a real air of thorough. I hope he's sitting here. Peter Alden, would you identify yourself? Where are you? Stand up. Stand up, Peter. What?
Right up.
Oh, he's up there. I'm sorry you can't see him. Right. Peter, you could have sat here with us. He's truly a great naturalist, and he went the bird route big time. Well, I decided then that I would do something else. And I have had very good vision in the eye remaining, and I discovered I could see fine detail. So soon I turned to what I call the little things that run the earth. I started with butterflies. I had episodes with snakes and frogs and that sort of thing. But I finally turned to the little things, six-legged things. And in time, I turned to those that are the most abundant on earth, ants. And I started working on them seriously when I was about 16, and before I went on to the University of Alabama. I came from the University of Alabama by way of University of Tennessee, never thinking I would head north, but the doors of opportunity opened for me here. And I have been here at Harvard for 59 years, working on the little things that run the earth. They do run the earth, especially ants, because it turns out, at least from figures we have in the Amazon, and I think it's not far off from what is the rest of the world, that ants make up 2/3 of the biomass of all the insects. In other words, if you go into a habitat and you weigh all the ants, and you weigh all of the insects, ants would make up 2/3, roughly. Ants outweigh all of the vertebrates in localities, mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, 4-to-1. So this was a group that I couldn't miss. In fact, everywhere I go, Cullen, anywhere, I still look for ants. And wherever you are, you can find them, and it's wonderful to rejoin them for brief periods of time in any part of the world. And that's what led me on then in the study of ants. But beyond that, many aspects of evolutionary biology and social behavior and so on.
Well, since your book is in many respects about ants and also about human society and the links between the two of them, I want to ask you something about that. There's a moment in the book when this wonderful character, Raph Cody, who, in some ways he seems like a character out of Willa Cather, and so he's applying to college, and he's an improbable applicant to college, but he does get in. But he writes a letter to the admissions dean, and this is one of those, those letters to an admissions dean that makes the admissions dean's day, I think. It's just a very unusual letter, and here's one paragraph from it. It tracks some of what you just had to say. Ants are very important in the environment, Raph Cody writes. I have read. If you weigh all the insects, ants make up 2/3. They weigh 4 times as much as all the birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians put together. But as you go on to show in this book, there are other reasons why we should pay attention to ants. It's about the way they organize themselves, and I wish you could talk a little bit about that. I think human beings have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the way ants organize themselves.
Let me add at this point that this is the ant part is the novella in the middle. It's called the Chronicle, the Ant Hill Chronicle, and this really is mostly a Southern novel about people and how they relate to one another and how they go over 3 generations, going from the passage from the Old South to the New South and the complications that are involved across class, across religious conflicts and so on. So I enjoyed rebuilding all of that for my hometown of Alabama, state of Alabama, and Mobile, my hometown. But, you know, may I read the very brief prologue, because actually that's the best way to manage this, to explain what I try to do with people and ants together, and the ecosystem. The three elements of this book are the people of this area and their distinctive traits. It's an insular, it's a place, Mobile, it's a little backwater city, and it's preserved traits that make it one of the few cities in America that have a soul. And that's how I've just finished the history of it, and that's how I've described it, because I can't stay away from it. But at any rate, this, I think, makes the point best. If I wrote it and read it, okay. This is a story about three parallel worlds which nevertheless exist in the same space and time. They rise together, they fall, they rise again, but in cycles so different in magnitude that each is virtually invisible to the others. The smallest are the ants who build civilizations in the dirt. Their histories are epics that unfold on picnic grounds. Their colonies are, like those of humans, are in perpetual conflict. War is a generic imperative of most, and indeed ants are the most warlike of all creatures. The colonies grow and struggle, and sometimes they triumph over their neighbors. Then they die, always. Human societies are the second world. There are, of course, vast differences between ants and men, but in fundamental ways, their cycles are similar. There is something genetic about this convergence. Because of it, ants are a metaphor for us, and we for them. Homer might have written equally of ants and men. Zeus has given us the fate of winding down our lives in painful wars from youth until we perish, each of us. Thousands of times greater in space and time is the third of our world, the biosphere, the totality of all life, plastered like a membrane over all of Earth. The biosphere has its own epic cycles. Humanity, one of the countless species forming the biosphere, can perturb it, but we cannot leave it or destroy it without perishing ourselves. The cycles of the other species can be destroyed and the biosphere corrupted, but for each careless step we take, our species will ultimately pay an unwelcome price, always. So that's basically the message, and introduces the three characters.
So my question to you, what you've just read is, those are themes in many ways that run through your entire body of work. And the people in your book speak about them in their own characters and so on. What made you turn, after 30 books, to fiction? And how much, the second question is, and how much of this is drawn from your own life? How much of you is in Raph Cody?
I'd say the boyhood is close. First novelists, I think, generally are expected to be autobiographical when they're writing, you know. So that's Raph up to the time he gets to college closely parallels my life. But Raph falls under the spell of, his mother's from a patrician Mobile family, and he falls under the spell of a wealthy, somewhat Philistine uncle who is determined that Raphael Sims, he's named after the great admiral of Confederate admirals, Raphael Sims Cody, is going to take his place, you know, as the male heir of the Mobile Sims. And he doesn't think that Raphael is going to do this, mucking around in the piney woods, wanting to be a ranger. So he gives him support to go in. His mother has married a redneck. That's cause of tremendous problems. At any rate, So he promises young Raph a free ride to any university he can get into, and then providing he also goes to any law school. That's determined. Uncle Cyrus is determined that Raph is going to get that kind of background, and he hopes it'll bend him in the right direction. Well, Raph is me up to the childhood, all the childhood experiences, and then deviates powerfully, so that I was able then to develop and study and learn a lot on my own. So I used up my childhood, and then I devoted a lot of them. I used up a lot of my relatives.
Mm-hmm. Are they still with us?
Yeah. Fortunately, most of them are gone, but my Aunt Nellie becomes Aunt Jessica. She's the family genealogist and blabbermouth and so on and on. So that when I've been asked, are you going to write another novel, especially about this part of the world, I say, no, I've used up all my relatives. That's basically the thrust of it in terms of connection to reality. The real reality, however, the human story. And I try to recreate the Southern culture as it has made this transition through and partway out of racism into what it is today and what it's like today, to describe what it's like today. But the realism comes in the natural history. I don't think any author has ever, in a novel, described the natural world as it really is in enough detail to bring it to life. And this is what we must do, I think, increasingly in the future. Most novelists take their character through, well, they take them through the dark woods to the lighted cabin. They have them thrash their way and find their way outside of the marsh where they discovered the body of the murdered person. So on. And you never know. You know, it's just a dark woods, it's just a grove of sycamore, just this or that. No, we are a biological species in a biological world. And we really have got to start thinking of ourselves more realistically that way. And so Raph, he is a child of nature who understands that and cares deeply, and he devotes and fashions his own life accordingly to save a part of nature. And that leads him into actually tremendous conflict in the boardroom of the developer country, a company that's about to destroy a priceless piece of old growth forest. It brings him into conflict with the radical right, religious fanatics of that area and so on. But the novel, why would I write a novel? Well, because I thought I could. First. But there's another reason, and that is that message that I just read in the prologue. I've tried in so many ways to get it across with nonfiction and different styles and lecturing, and finally it dawned on me that people respect nonfiction, but they read novels. People want a story, and they will read novels, and this is one way to get to them. So this is what I call my Billy Sunday strategy. And I've given you a long-winded answer.
No, not at all. But you didn't mention the 1,000-pound alligator.
Well, we'll come to that. But I'll tell you one thing, if I'm rattling on too long, you just remember you fell into the trap of interviewing a person who is both a Harvard professor and a Southerner. That's what we do for a living. Or, more aptly put, that's what we do on those hot summer nights out on the veranda sipping lemonade or sweet tea. At any rate, the novel was another way to get the message across, and do it, I hope, subtly so that it doesn't spoil the story. And I'm going to give you an imitation. I know I've done it in one recent lecture at Harvard, so bear up if you've already heard it. This is Billy Sunday my imitation of this famous evangelist of the 1920s, trying to save souls and fight sin. And he tries everything he can. He's going to throw everything he's got into fighting sin. So consider that I'm fighting extinction of species and ecosystems, okay? Billy Sunday. I hate sin. I hate it so much, I'm gonna fight it till I can't move my arms no more. And when I can't move my arms no more, I'm gonna bite it. And when I got no more teeth, I'm gonna gum it. That's gumming it.
So have you got the novel bug now?
The what?
Have you got a bee in your bonnet? That's probably the wrong metaphor for you, isn't it?
Well, actually, ant metaphor next time, please. Anyway, I hate saying this in the presence of a representative here of my publisher, but this is it. First, only, last. I'm back to nonfiction. I'm going right back. So, okay.
And what about the movie?
Oh, yes. Well,
there's always a first for that.
Well, every novelist dreams of a movie. I thought maybe there might be one of these far-out cinematographers of the kind who lurk around Harvard who would consider making a movie out of my biggest volume, which is a 578-page monograph entitled Phytoli in the New World, an analysis of a megadiverse genus of ants. I've received no feelers. Yeah. However, I have been invited out to Sundance by Robert Redford, a wonderful man. And we have spent 2 days getting acquainted, and he's expressed an interest in it.
Wait, in that? Oh, he's expressed an interest in this?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. That's great.
And suggested he'd like to consider it. So he's just now finished, and I guess it'll be in theaters before long, his movie on the Lincoln's conspirators. So I hope to hear from him. But there are others. We have other feelers from other. I think it would make an excellent movie. And if I sign for any of it, all I'm going to say is that Woody Allen will not play one of the ants.
Well, there's a character here that you could play.
What?
There's a character here that you could play.
I hope you're saying Fred Norval. No. Who?
Well,
okay, tell me.
Well, there's Fred Norval, and then there's also Bill Needham.
Oh yes.
Now here's how Bill Needham is described.
Yes.
In his late, no, not, leave the age aside, but he had the lean, hawk-like looks one expects to find in a veteran field biologist, but almost never actually does. He spoke in a low, carefully modulated voice and enjoyed pronouncing scientific names in the exact original Greek or Latin. His imperturbably calm, measured manner hid a passion within. You could play that role.
Maybe, but I actually modeled it on a friend of mine at Florida State University.
Which is where Ralph Cody ends up going.
And of course, there's several people that have been present living down there, including the one that the reporter, the journalist in there, Bill Robbins, is modeled on. So they know who they are, and I joke with them and I just say, anything that between that and you, any resemblance, of course, is complete coincidence, accident. None of them would sue me anyway. I don't think.
I mentioned at the outset that that I'd love to hear a little bit more just about writing, how you learned to write. I'm guessing probably that there's a lot of childhood reading that is reflected somehow in this, just stylistically. who are the novelists that you admired? Were any of them in the back of your minds while you were writing? But if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I'll admit that I'm a John D. MacDonald fan. I read novels occasionally, but they're mainly novels I read, like the Jack Aubrey series of Patrick O'Brian. I've read everything Patrick O'Brian ever wrote, and everything that John D. MacDonald, a Southern, Florida crime novelist, ever wrote. But I read, when I do that, it's to put me to bed. I have to read about 10 to 11, not for any other purpose, and I don't think they influence me very much. But like all undergraduates, I had my own powerful, transformative writers, notably among whom would be Sinclair Lewis, and and then of course, in my age, in my generation, my college years, that was, for those of you who were not alive at that time, this was, I think, roughly between the Boxer Rebellion in China and the Spanish-American War. But anyway, no, this was the late 40s. And it was Philip Wiley. I loved that man's style. That's a natural teenage rebellion. He was a highly favored best-selling author at the time, very influential. But writers who influenced me, no. I had too much time, too much concentration on scientific literature, doing research. And when I started writing this novel, I have one of the best editors in America. That's what really helped me. His name is Bob Weil at W.W. Norton. And he's been called by many one of the 10 best editors in America. And when I repeated that in front of the president of W.W. Norton at last night's Penn International Gala, the response I got back was 10, 10, and then I had to say, well, I heard that, but I said I wouldn't work with any of the other 9 if I knew them. Well, I had a really terrific guy, and Bob Weil kept saying to me while I was doing this, he said, Ed, you've got to read other novelists. You've got to read Faulkner. You have to read Harper Lee and so on. And I said, no. I wanted, win or lose, stand or fall. I wanted my own style of writing. You go into this. I wanted to be completely me. I didn't want to be influenced by any of them. So I will hereby declare I have never read a novel by a Southern author. I wrote a Southern book without doing that. I once read a short story by Eudora Welty and thought it was, I thought it was poor. It was just a short story. And then, just to tell a story, I suddenly had my opportunity to meet Harper Lee. And she apparently is a recluse on the same magnitude as J.D. Salinger. But since much of my work in and around Mobile, it's been down to do research, but also for conservation work, has focused on a magical area called the Red Hills. It's an unromantic name, but it's an area of deep ravines in the sides and bottoms of which are ice age trees and plants. Ice age, by which I mean during the advance of the last glacier. The northern and Appalachian flora and some of the fauna moved south very slowly, century by century, in advance of the ice. And some of it stayed in deep, cool ravines as the ice went back. And so this is an area unexplored biologically for the most part. And of course, like everything else, most of everything else down there, it's under threat from developers and loggers. That's the theme of the book. to, is these priceless areas that could go under before the conservation movement gets strong enough. But right now, there's a conflict developing. It's a raw part of the world in terms of the conflict between developers and the rapidly growing conservation movement. So I've been working with the Nature Conservancy and other groups there to make sure that Red Hills area somehow comes into private, or at least public, benevolent public ownership. And it turns out, by coincidence, so is Harper Lee. She's been, you know, that area is just 50 miles from Monroeville. Monroeville is where she stayed. That's where she was born. That's where Truman Capote was born. So when that was mentioned to her, she said she'd like to get together with me. So everybody jaw dropped, you know, so I was going to get to see Harper Lee. She's had a stroke. She's 84. And maybe she would come, maybe she would not. And we gathered. We had read a photo op. It would have been great. She didn't show. Then she said, oh, I'll join you for lunch later. She sent the message, didn't show. Then she said, I'll join you at the Bledsoe Plantation where we're having supper. Evening meal in the South is called supper. And the Bledsoe Plantation has a history. Forget it. Anyway, the present owners invited us to have supper and with a small group, and we did, and she didn't come, but she sent message by way of her friend of hers. Sorry, she would not come. She gave no reason. Her friend said, well, you know, she has good days, bad days, and she's always like that. She always says she will come, and then often she does not. How did I get into this? I thought
it was a lost opportunity for both of you.
This is a real good Southern story. How I came close, but I didn't get to meet Harper Lee.
Right. Well, I'm not going to ask about Gettysburg.
As you were writing the book, was about the time when they claimed to have found or refound the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker in Arkansas. It has since proved to have been wrong or misidentified. But were you thinking of having the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker be part of this book? Because I believe you're writing it while people thought maybe they are still alive, like Elvis.
It gets into the book and mentioned. This is, again, Peter Alden, my friend, speaking. And to be asked about the status of the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker by Peter Alden is sort of like having Einstein asking you to explain relativity. But I see, it's a personal question, okay. As Peter well knows, the Arkansas Ivory-Bill sighting created a tremendous stir and then fizzled out for reasons I won't go into now, but it's apparently an honest mistake. And we thought, well, that's the end of the Ivory-Bill. But no, another group from Auburn University, apparently, well, not apparently, from Auburn, claimed that they had definitely seen the Ivory-Bill in the Choctaw-Hatchie River. Floodplain forest. And as you all know, the Choctaw-Hatchie is just east of the Perdido River and west of the Apalachicola. Envision that, will you? It runs across the panhandle of Florida, and it's clothed on, bracketed on both sides by dense floodplain forest with cypress, just the kind of habitat Ivory-Bills would be in. So this group has made drawings, they said, with the Ivory-Bill, and they look good. They've made a recording, which I've heard, and the recording says, beep, 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 beep. I think that's unique to the Ivory-Bill, is it not, for that region? And at any rate, they have drawings of photographs of holes. It could be an Ivory-Bill hole. So they came to me and they said, would you sponsor an article that we would write on the basis of that evidence? I don't think I ever told you this story, Peter. No, you didn't. Well, it's interesting. You know, be a sponsor in a scientific journal because we think we really have it solid. And my answer was no, because after the Arkansas debacle, I mean, people are going to have good videography and solid, irrefutable evidence. They agreed, and they said, just wait now. This is summer. Wait until winter, because there are enough deciduous trees that the leaves will fall and you can see deeper into the forest. That was 2 years ago. Winter passed. No word. Now another winter has passed. No word. Peter, tell us, is the ivory-billed woodpecker extinct?
Apparently, yes.
What?
We can keep hope, but it's the biggest embarrassment in the history of American ornithology.
Yeah. Well, you asked me thanks for telling me that. I thought that would be the answer. I remember the one time I met Roger Torrey Peterson. You were a good friend of his, I'm sure. And I said, this was years ago, a year before he died. I said, is the ivory-bill, what's the status of the ivory-bill? He used one word, gone. Too bad. At any rate, it does enter in that young Raff, who is at the Knockabee tract, has a pretty good forest in the outlet stream that goes into the Chicopee. All those are fictitious, but they're very realistically described. And he dreams someday of seeing an ivory-bill. So it's worth keeping the dream alive, isn't it? Yeah, that's right.
I recently reread Walden, and that chapter on the ants caught me, stopped me dead in my tracks. What's your take on that chapter?
Well, I can explain that to you precisely. I have not only read Walden, but many times. And in the course of writing a book called The Future of Life, I opened the book with a letter to Henry David Thoreau. And I pronounce it Thoreau, because that's the insider's way of pronouncing it. That's the way the family pronounced it, apparently. And I spent lots of time there and with the Thoreau Society. So that's one book I read. In any case, Thoreau describes how outside his cabin. Can I call it a cabin? A shack, it was pretty humble. He saw a war going on. And there were red ants and black ants in battle. And he said and they were killing each other. It was of a ferocity, he said, that made the recent battles over in Concord and Lexington look like mere skirmishes. And he wondered what was going on in this war. What was going on, ironically, because he was one of the great abolitionists himself, was ant slavery. The red ants were the slave makers, and the black ants were the species they victimized. That is, you could call it almost like domestic animal because they're different species. And all summer long, if you watch for it, you will see slave raids going on. There are a number of species of slave-making ants here in New England. And I've actually done a lot of research on them and also worked out the pheromone language the slave makers use to communicate with one another during their raids on the ants they attack. And furthermore, I discovered what I call the propaganda substances. These ants release alarm pheromones that alarm the other species, but to which they are immune. It's sort of like attacking a redoubt, a fort, with extremely loud noise, the way we captured Noriega. But like most Americans, we're deaf to that kind of music. So anyway, that's the answer to that. It's an interesting bit of natural history. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, the question has to do with Raff's father, who is both a sympathetic and a not sympathetic character. He has rough edges, but he also has admirable qualities. Yeah. And the question has to do with where does he come from?
Yeah, he comes, he's a redneck. And in the history I've just finished, I take, it's the history of the area, I take some pleasure in working out the history of the rednecks, where they came from. And I could spend the rest of the evening on this this favorite subject. The rednecks at the time of the Civil War, that is, all of the people of the South, were 3/4 of descended from people from the Celtic edge, so-called. The more rebellious areas of the Scotch-Irish, the Hebrides, Scotland, and the Highlands of parts of England, the very areas that had been in rebellion pretty much against the crown for all that time. And in fact, they arrived in that area through South Carolina and Tennessee, in part because in the 1700s, the British government encouraged them with land grants to leave the British Isles and come and settle. And so they came over, and they brought these Celtic qualities with them. They were raw-edge frontiersmen. For the most part, they were freeholders, but some of them then got into the plantation business and began the great tragedy of slavery, because that's how you made big money during the cotton boom. And they had the qualities that most historians agree. I know you're not supposed to stereotype ethnic groups, but you can do it safely. I'm one of them, around me anyway. They tend to be, to stress honor over law. They are very fiercely independent. They are quarrelsome. They believe in a code of honor. They are quick to challenge when they feel that they're insulted or code of honor is insulted. They believe highly in gallantry and bravery. They are reckless. They do not like people telling them what to do. They love guns, and so on. And if that's a bitter stereotype, in fact, there's a tremendous amount of truth to it. And thus arose the redneck culture of the area. They were very well off until finally the tragedy of slavery caught up with the South. It was a Greek tragedy. It was inevitable. Once we started on that path, then there could be only one solution. Churchill once referred to it in its great history of the Civil War, that this was the noblest and most inevitable conflict of which we to that time have record. And thus they went into the war. And when they did, the cotton industry continued, but it could only be continued by white and black becoming sharecroppers. They no longer could own slaves, and they all had to work the land themselves. And the sharecropper system was cruel and debilitating, and it produced large population of rural whites who you find at the lowest point of their evolution depicted dramatically and painfully, and let us now praise famous men, photographed by Walker Evans and James Agee's description. But many of them also went into the towns and cities. And as Rick Bragg, a recent British Southern writer, has brilliantly described it in his book, The Most They Ever Had. They have this combination of qualities, which I have put into Raphael Sim Cody's father, Ainsley Cody, which is inner nobility, strong code of honor, personal, but with crudity and recklessness and love of guns, that contrasts him strongly with the more patrician Sims, who had made their fortune before the Civil War and now occupied wealth and power in the city of Mobile. Great.
How are we doing?
How is the human species doing, or how is...
with respect to what you... this has to do with the book Consilience, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And...
yeah. That'll give you an idea of how we're doing. Actually, in the 1970s was a very bad time for the American intelligentsia and chattering class, because At that time, the social sciences were pretty well dominated by a view that the brain is a blank slate. This is a blank slate view. And I won't go into it except to say that this is in diametrical opposition to what the biologists were developing, and cognitive psychologists as well at that time in the 70s. And geneticists. There was already very substantial evidence that, in fact, there is a human nature. And we knew many of the qualities of it. Some of them are spelled out in On Human Nature. And since that time, of course, we've now taken the subject to down to the level of human genetics, to brain science, to genetic program pathways and human behavior. Come to understand that the traits that make up human nature probably have an adaptive significance that dates back hundreds of thousands of millions of years, and that they represent predispositions, not, unmovable instincts as you would have in animals, especially insects. So all of this has evolved into and absorbed into parts of genetics, brain science, and also given rise to the subdiscipline of evolutionary psychology, which is a spin-off of sociobiology. I don't know if that's the answer to your question.
I think there may be a second part to the question.
Oh, which is?
Well, it's this. So the first part is just what was it that you were, what were the ideas that you were advancing? But as I remember consilience, there's another part to it which has to do with, well, once we understand the implications of what makes us tick in a certain way, what does that tell us about the way we should organize ourselves as a society? And I think that may be the other part of the question.
Yeah, well, that's
and how are we doing on that score?
Well, that's a good answer. And so for some reason, there were people, intellectuals, not many, but who believed that just to talk about it was dangerous, because it would give people ideas that maybe there were differences between sexes, that there were differences between races, and that, and that was it. I'm familiar with the ideological suppression of free speech and ideas. We spent a lot of time at the Penn International Gala last night listening to stories from Burma. Particularly focused on the repression of real ideas in China, and the people who are now in prison because the regime didn't want to have certain ideas talked about. Well, that's what happened to a substantial degree at that time, and I think all that's long since forgotten. And what was the question again? Well, yeah, go on.
If we understand your ideas about how society...
Oh, yes, of course. What are we to make of it? Well,
yes.
I went on and wrote other books, including Consilience, and developed the whole concept of the unification of disciplines on into the social sciences. I might add that the decision was made yesterday, incidentally. The Penn International is preeminently a literary organization, but I attended a meeting yesterday when it was decided that there would be a Penn prize for science writing, and that sort of shows that we're opening up, we're beginning to meet. Now, why should we know about these things? For the same reason that a doctor should know something about human anatomy and physiology before he prescribes medicine. Precisely the same. I mean, if we have a structured brain and a propensity to behave in certain ways, and we are almost absurdly irrational in our behavior. I like to say that our problem is due to the fact that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and it's an extremely dangerous combination. So what we need to know is why we have these Paleolithic emotions, why we cling to medieval institutions, and with absurd faithfulness, tribalism, and so on. We need to know why we are the way we are before we can begin to find a better life. If we keep making it a warfare of ideology and religions, then we're really going to be in deep trouble, because our technology really allows us to destroy not only each other but the whole world. And that's one reason that I keep coming back as long as I've got the pulpit here. This is a Southern Baptist pastor,
and you can have it for a few more minutes.
I think that the distinction between an ant society and a human society is very much that the ant colony is a super organism, and to a substantial degree. And I have a couple of colleagues, I don't know if either is in this room, but I don't see them yet, Martin Novak and Corina Ternita. Is either one here? Either one of them here? At any rate, we are working together now. They're mathematicians, and we're working on a whole new approach to this, which is putting more and more emphasis on an insect colony as a superorganism, which is essentially really the queen. In the case of the hymenopterans, ants, bees, wasps, and ants, bees, and wasps, is essentially the subject of natural selection, the object, the target. And all those workers showing altruistic behavior, self-sacrifice for the colony, are in effect an extension of her genetic material. Darwin first made that suggestion, incidentally, in The Origin of Species. And now we're beginning to drift back to that perception, but in a far more sophisticated way. That is not true of human beings. Human beings originated extremely complex societies in a very different way. And that is, we kept our reproductive potential, we kept our individuality, but at the same time, we developed strong propensities that could be called a tribal instinct. We bond together quickly, form groups, and we have group versus group almost universal as a human trait.
What piece of advice would you give to people who are in their teens who want to go into scientific work and who want to go into environmental and conservation work? What's the most important thing that you would tell them?
Yes. Look, in case you haven't noticed, there's increasing agreement among scientists, including biologists, even my proud colleagues in molecular and cell biology and biomedical research, that we in biology are entering the age of synthesis, meaning that we're going to be having to pay much more attention to complex systems, the way all these elements that they've been dissecting and identifying are put together to create cells, organisms, and beyond that, whole ecosystems. We're now moving in that direction, and there's going to be synthesis going on. We need broadly trained biologists who have, in addition to a basic background in the sciences, pay attention to how you analyze complex systems. So that's something to keep in mind. This century is going to be the age of biology. I mean, it's preeminent already. This is going to be the age of the environment in which we settle down before we wreck the planet. Put them together, and now you know what to do. Take biology, get a broad background, become expert in one area, but be prepared to move quickly with others, and particularly in partnerships and research, to one combination of problems and techniques to another. And then realize that what you're doing is absolutely crucial in saving the environment, as it would also be if you went into medicine and did similar research to save people individually.
And don't forget to write the novel.
Okay.
Thank you very much. This has been a treat and a thrill to be with you.